The Middle Ages began with a turning point, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in year 476. This event shattered the political and administrative unity that Rome had maintained for centuries. What followed was not an immediate collapse into chaos, but a gradual transformation into a new social and political order. Europe became politically fragmented as a centralized Roman authority gave way to small kingdoms and tribal lands. These were ruled by local chieftains, Germanic warlords, and emerging monarchs. Law and order became highly localized, with little coordination between regions. Economically, the collapse of long distance trade and urban infrastructure pushed people toward the countryside. The economy turned rural and self sufficient, centered on agriculture. Towns shrank, coinage disappeared in many places, and barter returned as the main mode of exchange. Most of the population worked as peasants on manorial estates. In this vacuum, the Roman Catholic Church rose to prominence not just as a religious force but also a political and intellectual leader. The Pope became more influential than many kings, and the Church's reach extended into every aspect of life, from moral authority to education and administration. With the decline of Roman law, bureaucracy, and urban culture, the classical ideals of unity and citizenship faded. In their place grew localized traditions, customary law, and personal loyalty to lords or kin groups. This set the stage for the development of feudalism, the defining structure of medieval Europe. In short, the early medieval period was a time of adaptation where the remains of the Roman world blended with Germanic customs and Christian faith to form the basis of a new European civilization. Feudalism was the dominant political and social system in medieval Europe. It was based on land ownership and mutual obligations. The king granted large pieces of land to nobles, who in turn gave smaller portions to knights and vassals. At the bottom were peasants who worked on the land. This system worked on the principle of land in exchange for loyalty and service. Vassals promised to fight for their lords or provide other support. In return, they got land, which gave them income and authority over the local population. Alongside this, the manorial system managed the local economy. Each manor was a self contained unit with fields, villages, a church, and sometimes a mill or blacksmith. Everything needed for daily life was produced within the manor. Serfs or peasants lived on the manor. They worked the fields, gave part of their produce to the lord, and had few rights. In return, they got protection and a small portion of land to cultivate. Movement between the social classes was almost impossible. A person born as a serf usually remained one for life. The entire structure reinforced stability but also kept society rigid. This system defined both the economy and the power structure of medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, the Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful institution. It claimed spiritual authority over all Christians and played a major role in shaping daily life and politics. The church said it could guide people to salvation. This gave it control over religious practices like baptism, marriage, and burial. People feared excommunication, which meant being cut off from the church and the community. Popes often had more influence than kings. They could approve or reject monarchs and interfere in political disputes. Some popes even called for wars like the Crusades. The idea of church authority over secular rulers was widely accepted. The church had a strong internal hierarchy. At the top was the pope, followed by cardinals, bishops, priests, and monks. Each had a role in maintaining order and spreading the faith. Monasteries were important centers of life. They copied manuscripts, taught a basic education, treated the sick, and helped the poor. Monks lived by strict rules and stayed away from worldly life. The church also became rich. It owned large areas of land and collected tithe, that is, one tenth of a person's produce or income. In many regions, church land rivaled the holding of kings and nobles. The church's power was not just religious, it was a political and economic force in the medieval Europe. Medieval European society was highly hierarchical. Social classes were fixed, and moving between them was extremely rare. This structure was seen as natural and God given. Society was often divided into three main groups: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The clergy handled spiritual matters, the nobility took charge of defense and administration, and the peasants provided labor. The nobility were landowners and military leaders. They received land from the king and had peasants working under them. They collected taxes, settled disputes, and had the right to raise armies. The clergy held both spiritual and worldly power. They often came from noble families. The church owned land and influenced both local communities and royal decisions. Peasants formed the majority of the population. They worked on the land, lived under manorial obligations, and had limited rights. Some were free, but many were serfs who could not leave the land without permission. This strict social structure ensured order but also limited change. It shaped how people lived, worked, and interacted for centuries. Peasants were not a single class, they were divided based on their legal status and the nature of their obligations to the Lord. Serfs were bonded peasants. They could not leave the manor without permission. They were tied to the land and owed labor services, a part of their produce, and various dues to the Lord. Villeins were semi free. They worked for the Lord but had more rights than serfs. They could pass land to their children and sometimes pay rent in money instead of only labor. Free peasants had better conditions. They rented land, moved freely, and owed fewer duties. However, they still lived within the manor system and followed manorial rules. Most peasants had to work on the lord's estate, which was the land directly controlled by the lord. They also farmed their own plots but gave part of the harvest as a tax. Despite the differences, all types of peasants depended on the manor for protection, justice, and basic needs. During the latter Middle Ages, towns began to grow as the trade revived. After centuries of limited commerce, long distance trade routes re-emerged. Merchants traded with the Islamic world, Asia, and Africa, bringing goods like spices, silk, and precious metals. Towns became centers of commerce and craft production. People started living in urban areas where markets and workshops flourished. These towns were often located near rivers or key trade routes. The market economy began to replace the old subsistence system. Townspeople engaged in selling goods and services. The growing wealth led to the rise of guilds, that is, organizations of workers in the same trade, such as blacksmiths or weavers. Guilds set standards, regulated prices, and protected workers' rights, providing a degree of job security. Merchants became important figures in medieval society. They acted as intermediaries between producers and consumers, moving goods across Europe and beyond. Their activities helped stimulate local economies and increased political influence as towns gained power. This urban revival marked a major shift in medieval life. It laid the groundwork for the economic transformations of the Renaissance. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns launched by the Roman Catholic Church primarily to recapture Jerusalem and other holy sites from Muslims. These wars, fought between 1096 and 1270, were promoted by the Church to unite Christians and extend its influence. The Pope played a central role in initiating the Crusades. He called for Christian knights and commoners to join in what's seen as a religious duty to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The First Crusade, that is between 1096 to 1099, was the only successful one. Crusaders captured Jerusalem and established Christian kingdoms in the Levant. However, the other crusades largely failed to achieve lasting control over the region. Beyond the battles, the Crusades had significant cultural and intellectual impact. As the Crusaders moved through the Middle East, they came into contact with advanced Muslim civilizations. This led to the transfer of knowledge, especially in areas like medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Europeans also gained access to the luxury goods such as spices, textiles, and fine metalwork, which had long lasting effects on trade and culture in Europe. While the Crusades were religiously motivated, their consequences were deeply cultural, helping to bridge the gap between the Islamic and Christian worlds. The Black Death struck Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated one third of the population. The plague caused by bacteria, spread by fleas on rats, devastated towns and villages, leaving communities in fear and confusion. The social structure of Europe was severely disrupted. With so many people dead, labor shortages became widespread, fields went untended, trade slowed, and cities faced economic decline. However, the scarcity of workers also led to higher wages for peasants and artisans, offering them some leverage. Economically, the plague brought significant hardship, trade networks broke down, and agricultural production fell. Yet, in some cases, it also sparked innovation, with new techniques being adopted to cope with labor shortage. The feudal system began to weaken, with fewer peasants to work the land. The authority of lords declined. Serfs could demand better terms, and many left the countryside for towns seeking better opportunities. This massive shift in society, along with the end of the plague, set the stage for the Renaissance. The economic and social changes led to a more centralized form of government and the rise of powerful monarchies. This marked a shift towards the modern era.